We told the police where to dig to find a body that they had been looking for. This was on a missing person case involving a young man who had gone out one evening to meet friends and never came home, just vanished. By all accounts, the missing person was a fine young man. He had a good job, was responsible, came from a close knit family that he had a good relationship with. He had no history of legal trouble, no history of substance abuse or gambling or anything that would bring him into contact with a rough crowd. No history of depression or mental illness or anything that would account for this kind of disappearance. The police investigated, but there wasn't much to go on, and they came up empty handed. And by the time our team at the Husick Group was brought in to assist, this case was cold. We'll come back to this story in a minute, and I will tell you more about what the viewers on our team found and what the police did next when we passed that information on to them. But let me take a minute now to introduce myself and the topic of this presentation. I'm Gail Husick, the founder of the Husick Group, LLC. I am a licensed private investigator, and I trained at the University of Washington's top-rated civilian PI training program. I also have a degree from Harvard Law School, and prior to founding the Husick Group, I was a partner at a large law firm in Silicon Valley, where I worked primarily with corporate clients in the technology sector. I have been trained and mentored for many years in controlled remote viewing, or CRV, by Lynn Buchanan, who is a former member of the U.S. Army's remote viewing unit at Fort Meade. The Husick Group draws on an international team of over 24 professional remote viewers to serve clients ranging from individuals to businesses to law enforcement to government. We work on cases ranging from missing persons to lost or stolen objects, archaeological searches, background research for journalists, even research in the medical field and technology field. Um, really, anything where a client has a need for difficult or impossible to find information, we can help. This presentation is entitled Managing the Client for Success, a Decade of Operational Remote Viewing. And as the title suggests, in this presentation, I'll be sharing highlights from a number of the Husick Group's case files from the past 10 years. Many of these examples have not been publicly shown before, and for confidentiality reasons, on some of them, I will only be able to show you parts of the case and not any identifying information. But on others, the clients have generously consented to sharing their stories, and it's a real treat to be able to show both the remote viewing work that our team did and also the feedback that we received from the clients once their cases were solved. I was originally invited to deliver this presentation at a live conference of remote viewers in Las Vegas in the spring of 2020, but due to the COVID-19 situation, that did not happen. And rather than waiting for another live venue, I decided to go ahead and record this presentation so that I could share it with the remote viewing community. As a result, I realized this may reach a broader audience than just remote viewers, which is great. But because of that, I'd like to take just a minute and give some background information about what remote viewing is and to cover a few of the terms that I'll be using later in the presentation. If you're already a remote viewer, bear with me, this will just take a couple minutes. And if you're new to remote viewing, I hope that this provides a useful orientation that helps you get more out of the presentation. Okay, so what is remote viewing? In a nutshell, remote viewing is the process of using your mind to gather information about a target that you cannot access with your normal physical senses. So the target can be just about anything. It could be a location, like the location of a missing person. It could be an object, like a missing piece of evidence or a piece of technology. It could be a person, say a criminal perpetrator. It could be an activity or an event, such as a terror attack or a manufacturing process. It can really be anything. The reasons that you might not be able to access it with your ordinary senses could be things like the target is far away from you, or it's hidden, or you don't know where it is, or perhaps it's separated from you in time. It could be in the past or in the future. If this is starting to sound like psychic work to you, you would be right. remote viewing is a special type of psychic work. A lot of remote viewers don't like to use the term psychic. It has a lot of baggage. There's an unfortunate history of fraud in the field. So understandably, remote viewers often want to distance themselves from that. But I think it's important to be upfront that it is in the psychic field. The important distinction between remote viewing specifically and psychic work generally is that remote viewing relies on a structured methodology to allow the practitioner, known as a remote viewer, to get past the noise of the conscious mind and access and report accurate information from the subconscious level. When people first hear that the US government and the US military were involved in remote viewing, they often have trouble believing that. And to those people, I would say go do your own research. This information started getting declassified in the mid 90s. There is a ton of information out there now. Um, and just to help you get started, I'd like to show you a few titles that you could take a look at. This CRV manual, compiled by Daz Smith, contains the manuals originally written by members of the U.S. Army unit in the mid-1980s while they were in the unit. And it's a good record of the step-by-step scientific process that they used in their remote viewing. As members of the U.S. Army unit retired and entered civilian life, many of them have written memoirs and training manuals on remote viewing. One of my favorites is The Seventh Sense by Lynn Buchanan. Also, Joe McMoneagle's Memoirs of a Psychic Spy, and Paul Smith's Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Another resource, if you want to get into a lot of the technical detail, is the Stargate Archive's reports of the U.S. government-sponsored PSI program. This collection of research reports was compiled by Ed May, who was one of the chief scientists on the government program. And you'll notice that one of the forewords was written by William S. Cohen. That name may be familiar to you. He was the former ranking member of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee and also the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration. I think it's up to each person to make up his or her own mind as to how well remote viewing works, but it is a well-established fact that it was used extensively by the U.S. government and the U.S. military, both in terms of research and operational uses. The particular type of remote viewing that we use at the Husick Group is known as controlled remote viewing, or CRV. CRV consists of a step-by-step process that was scientifically developed at Stanford Research Institute under government contract and used by the U.S. military in the Army's remote viewing unit during the Cold War. Most of the professional viewers at the Husick Group were trained directly by members of the Army's remote viewing unit or by the next generation of trainers who were trained by those U.S. Army viewers. This video is not a training video. I'm going to be showing a lot of examples of our work at the Husick Group, examples from our case files, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the nitty-gritty of how remote viewing works. There's a lot of information on that that's publicly available. There are many people out there offering remote viewing training, some of them more reputable than others. If you're interested in getting training, there are some recommendations on the Husick Group website on the facts page. Even though this is not a training video, I do want to introduce a few concepts about the remote viewing process. The first is that when a viewer sits down to do his or her work, it's a very deliberate and controlled activity where the viewer follows this step-by-step process to get information about the target. It's not like in the movies where they just get hit with this spontaneous download of information. The viewer reports his or her perceptions in a written session that follows a very specific format. And again, the details of that format are beyond the scope of this presentation, but suffice it to say that the structure is very important. Remote viewing is basically a signal to noise challenge, And this highly disciplined structure is what assists the viewer in obtaining increasingly strong contact with the target and in reporting perceptions in a way that can be understood by the analyst. And I think the best way to explain this is just to show you a couple of pages from a remote viewing session so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, here's a page. It's the first page of a session on a project I'm going to be explaining more about later in the presentation. You can see there's, it's highly structured. Again, I'm not going to go into the technical detail, but I do want to point out a couple of things. One is near the top of the page, it has something that says tasking or front loading. And it says the target is a man-made object at a location. Describe and sketch the object. Describe and sketch the location with emphasis on the area immediately surrounding the object. This viewer did not know what their target was, and typically viewers don't. This is called blind tasking. And the reason for keeping viewers blind to the target is to prevent their imagination or their conscious analysis coming in and trying to figure out what the target is. We really want the viewers to be getting perceptions from the subconscious and reporting those without getting all cluttered and mixed up with imagination and logic. So this viewer was only told that his target was an object at a location, and that's what we needed a description of. It turned out that it was a missing passport we were trying to help a client locate, but the viewer was not told that until after he had turned in all of his written session work. After that, you'll see down here a set of numbers, 1703205460331. Those are known as coordinates. They don't contain any information about the target, really. 170320 means that this file was opened on March 20th, 2017. And then the number below that is an identifying number unique to the viewer who's performing this session. There's nothing in there that would tell the viewer that this was a passport or a missing object or anything like that. Here is page 7 of that same session. So the viewer's a little further into it and is starting to get information. He's found an object and he's giving some information about it. And he says that it is green, slippery, smooth, shiny, polished metallic. It has this curved or spherical shape. He then goes on and sketches a more detailed sketch with a flat thing on top and then the bulge and a flat bottom. This is pretty typical of a CRV session. As you'll see later, it turns out many of these descriptors are accurate, but not all, which again is typical. You're rarely going to get 100% accuracy, and what you're hoping for is clues that are sufficient to solving the client's problem. Down towards the bottom, you'll see at the very bottom, it says SC radar dome. That SC stands for stray cat, which is a technical term. It's an acronym for a much longer phrase that you don't need to worry about right now. But basically what it means is something about this target reminds the viewer of, in this case, a radar dome. The viewer's not saying that this is a radar dome. He's saying he has a stray cat. In other words, the target, something about the target reminds him of a radar dome. Another term that I'll be using is AOL, or analytic overlay. That's a related concept where the conscious mind comes in and tries to guess what the target is. So the viewer may be going along, getting perceptions, and then and those perceptions may be accurate, but then the viewer's conscious mind tries to take over and name or guess what that is, and that may be inaccurate. An example I like to give is if a viewer is going along and perceives that the target is red and round and rubbery, and the conscious mind says, oh, I know what that is, that's a toy ball. The red, round, rubbery part might be right, but the conclusion that it's a toy ball might be wrong. It might be a poached apple or one of those plumbing floats for your toilet, or a human heart. There's lots of things that are red and round and rubbery. And so analytic overlay is something that we want to distinguish from the basic perceptions themselves. A big part of the CRV that we use at the Husick Group is designed specifically to help the viewer pull apart or keep separate those basic perceptions from conclusions which may be inaccurate. Okay, that's it for background. And now you've seen what a remote viewing session looks like. I hope that's helpful, and we'll give you an image to refer to as we talk about it in the presentation. Let's get back to the story of our missing person. So the viewers on the missing person case worked blind per our normal protocols. They were given coordinates, which is that unique numeric identifier that distinguishes this target from any other target they might be working on, but it contains no information about the target itself. So in this case, the viewers were told only that what was needed was a description of the location. They were given no information about the missing person, about the background of the case, even about the region of the world where the person had gone missing. So they went to work and they did a great job. They produced some very detailed descriptions and sketches of the target location with a lot of information about unique features of that spot. They gave information about specific buildings, including architectural details and purpose and use of some of those buildings. They drew maps of the surrounding area and surrounding landmarks. Several viewers used a particular word, which became important once we kind of figured out where we were. They described historical events associated with that particular spot. There were very strong patterns in the information they were providing about the target location. And that's one of the advantages of working with a team as opposed to a single viewer. When those patterns start emerging, those often turn out to be very important clues. It's important to note that viewers describe a target. They typically don't identify the target. So for instance, on a location of a missing person, you can get a very rich description of the surrounding area, lots of details, lots of sketches, but it would be unusual for them to, say, give an address. And that's part of the challenge of analysis, is you get this information, and even if it's highly accurate, matching it to a place on the map can be a challenge sometimes. In this particular case, I spent hours on Google Maps trying to find a match for what the viewers were describing. And then at one point, I saw in one of the viewers' sessions a description of a particular landmark. And I was able to search for that, and I found it. And once I found that landmark, everything else that the viewers had described fell into place. The buildings, what they're used for, the surrounding terrain, surrounding landmarks. It turned out that that word that I mentioned that several viewers had used in their sessions turned out to be the name of the main street that went right through that spot. So at this point, based on the viewers' work and having found that area, we had things narrowed down to an area smaller than 1 square block. And that was really exciting. The only thing that was puzzling to me at that point is I could not figure out how someone could have hidden a body there. This was not out in the country where somebody could come and hide a body in a shallow grave or something like that. This is a developed area. There are buildings and businesses and streets and sidewalks. And even if someone had come in the middle of the night, and even if they had gotten lucky and no one else had driven by while they were trying to hide the body, it's not really clear where they would have buried it without leaving evidence. They would have had to have, destroyed something else that was there. So that didn't make any sense. And yet the viewer's work was a very strong match for this spot. I really couldn't imagine that there was another place on the planet that was such a strong match. So I did some research in the town records and discovered that during the time period when our missing person went missing, that particular spot had been scheduled for some pretty major construction. And assuming that was on schedule at that time, very likely was torn up, had been excavated and would have provided a very good spot to hide a body. So this was very exciting. And I was very excited and proud to present all this information to law enforcement. And I conveyed all of that to them, and then nothing happened. 5 years went by between the time I delivered that report and the time I made this slide. And I want to be clear, this was not one of those cases where a group of psychics came and dumped a bunch of information on law enforcement on an unsolicited basis. This was a case we had been invited to work on. We had spent quite a bit of time, or I had spent quite a bit of time talking to the detective in charge of the case before our team did its work to make sure that he understood what remote viewing was and what type of information we'd be giving him, and that if it was actionable, that he would be willing to follow up on it. So why am I starting this presentation with the story of an unsolved case? We have solved cases. We have some that I'm going to show you later in the presentation together with feedback. But why am I starting with this story? I'm starting with this story because I want to drive home the point that on operational projects, it takes more than good viewing to have a successful outcome. In this particular case, we literally put a pin in the map. It doesn't get any better than that. The viewing was good, as far as I can tell. We'll know for sure when we get feedback. But as far as what viewing looks like at that stage of a project, it really doesn't get much better than what we delivered. And the fact that the town records even backed up the viability of this spot for hiding a body was very important. So obviously it takes more than good viewing to get a successful outcome. And a lot of things have to go right on the client side. And don't get me wrong, remote viewing is absolutely essential. Without good viewers, there is no project. And I'm grateful every day for the amazing viewers I get to work with at the Husick Group. But I have learned after doing this for 10 years that there are really 3 essential elements to a successful operational project. Those 3 elements are picking good clients, doing good work, of course, and managing the client relationship. Any one of those 3 is a potential point of failure on an operational project. Because this presentation is about client work, I'll be spending most of the time talking about the first one, picking good clients, and the third one, managing the client relationship. And I'll be illustrating both of those with lots of examples of work from our team. Let's move on to picking good clients. So what is a good client? When I was practicing law, we had a saying at our law firm that a good client was someone with lots of problems and lots of money. That's not what I'm talking about here. Everything I talk about today will be equally applicable to pro bono projects as it is to paying projects. We've done a lot of pro bono projects at the Husick Group over the years, and I can tell you that the same issues come up on both the paying and the pro bono projects. So if you are involved in remote viewing for any period of time and you let people know that you're a remote viewer, you will eventually be asked to view a target for someone. And I think it's a good idea to give some thought in advance to the criteria you will use for deciding whether or not you'll do a target for someone. Because people will ask for all kinds of crazy stuff. And if you don't have some idea of how you're going to make that decision, you may find yourself getting dragged into things you really don't want to be involved in. So how do you decide? At the Husick Group, over the years we've been doing this, I've developed a short set of filters that I run new project requests through in deciding whether it's something we want to do. And we actually end up turning down a lot more work than we take on because we run them through these filters. And I'm going to share those with you now. They're just ideas. This is what works for us. You may find a different set of filters works for you, but hopefully there's something useful in here. The first filter is, what do you want to do? Remote viewing can be used for almost an infinite number of applications. And some people use it to try to make money, picking lottery numbers or guessing stock prices. Some people like to look at esoteric targets, UFOs, that kind of thing. Missing person work is an obvious application, technology development, archaeological digs. It's really almost unlimited. Um, and I don't think there's really a right answer or a wrong answer. It depends on what you want to do. At the Husick Group, the way I've answered that question for what we do is we like to focus on real world problems that are likely to have feedback if the client's problem gets solved. So things like missing person work. That person's somewhere, there is a right answer. If the case gets solved, we will get feedback. Technology development is another area I really like working on. But as I said, there's not one right answer. There might be something different you like to work on. That's fine. If you decline a project and there's nothing else really wrong with it other than it's just not something you're interested in, I would recommend that you remember that you're part of a community and there may be other remote viewers out there who'd really like to work on that project. So if you think it's an appropriate project and it's just not something that's your thing, you might consider passing it on to someone else. So let's say someone comes to you with a project, and after hearing about it, you decide it is something that you're interested in doing. What's the next step? What's the next filter? The next filter I would suggest is due diligence. What is that? Due diligence is a fancy term that means you ask the questions you need to ask to figure out if something is as it should be. Other ways to say that are that it passes the smell test, that you kick the tires, there's no red flags, pick your metaphor. But basically, you're checking to make sure that everything is legit and that you're not getting involved in something that you don't really want to be involved in. The fact is, people will lie to get what they want from you. They'll lie and they'll ask for really inappropriate things sometimes. And it's your job and your responsibility to filter that. If you don't, then real people can get hurt. Um, you may be providing information to someone who's going to misuse it to violate someone else's privacy or worse. And your viewers can also get hurt. Remember, the viewers are working blind, and it's the project manager's job to check out the project and make sure that they're not leading that team of viewers into something that they really wouldn't want to be involved in if they had known what it was about. Um, so how do you do due diligence? Um, it depends on the particular situation, but it's basically common sense. You ask the questions that a normal person would have about, hey, does this make sense? Is this right? Let me give you some examples. If someone comes with a story about a missing person and they want your help locating that person, they may have a story, it's a vulnerable relative and they need to find them quickly. Can you help? Something like that. Um, they may be telling the truth, and in which case you may want to help them. But also, if they're telling the truth, they've probably filed a police report. And one of the ways at the Husick Group that we make sure we don't get into inappropriate situations is we only do missing person work through the police. Because someone may tell you a story about why they're looking for someone, but in fact, you don't know. You could be helping someone who has a restraining order against them find their victim. We had a potential client come to us one time and ask if we could help find the perpetrator of a drive-by shooting who had killed a childhood friend of his. And I said, of course, that's the kind of thing that we can use remote viewing for. Could you put me in touch with the police detective in charge of your case? And he said, oh, we're not using the police. We don't want to go through the police. And by the way, money's no object, which didn't make me feel better. And he wanted video of the viewers doing their work, which also did not make me feel better. That was not something I was going to touch with a 10-foot pole. Why did he need that information if he wasn't going to go through the police? That's sounded like a gang situation or drugs or someone who was bent on revenge. Just not something I wanted to get involved in. We've done work on archaeology type projects, treasure hunt type projects, and one of the first questions I always ask on those is whether the prospective client owns the property they're planning to search, or if they have a plan to gain legal access to the property they're planning to search. Most of the time after I ask that question, I never hear from them again, which tells me they were planning to trespass and steal things, or they maybe just hadn't really thought the whole thing through. But in any event, it was not something I wanted to get involved in. We have done those projects, though, where the person did have a legal right to the property. We did one recently where the person came and made the request and said that he owned the property. And I was able to check the county tax records, and in fact, he did own the property. So that was an easy yes. Um, in the technology field, we've been asked to do things like help someone get information about intellectual property of a defense contractor. Um, I hope it's obvious why we didn't do that. First of all, it sounded like corporate espionage or theft of intellectual property. And it also sounded like it was probably classified information or things having to do with national security. Um, just wildly inappropriate. Um, I'm almost speechless why someone would come and ask me to do that for them and think that we would. Um, the basic rule of thumb that I use is if I wouldn't do it with my normal senses, right? If I wouldn't use my eyes or my ears to gather this information and give it to someone, why on earth would I give it to them using remote viewing abilities? Um, so basically with due diligence, don't make this harder than it is. It's common sense. As I said, it'll vary from situation to situation, but you'll have a good sense of what questions to ask. If someone is really intent on committing an elaborate fraud, you may not, you may, they may get it past you, but I think 99 times out of 100, just asking some basic questions will smoke out what you need. I would say to trust your gut. If it doesn't feel right at the beginning, it's not going to feel better as you get involved further. And I think really the most important word in a remote viewer's vocabulary is the word no. If it doesn't feel right, um, don't do it. And if someone takes offense at your asking the questions you need to ask to make sure it's legit, that's a red flag in and of itself. So let's say a new project comes in and it makes it through those first two filters. It's something you want to do and it passes the due diligence test. The next filter that I run things through is I ask, does this client want the truth? And that may seem like an odd question at first. It should be a no-brainer. Of course they want the truth. If they didn't want the truth, why would they be coming and asking for your help? But it's actually not that uncommon for clients to come and I get the sense that they've already decided what the right answer is, and they're really just looking for me to confirm it. And those kinds of clients, if you come back and give them the answer they were looking for, they're very happy and they think you are the greatest remote viewer in the world. And if you come back with something different, they can be very upset, very frustrated, and they think you're a terrible remote viewer. So those kinds of projects can really be an exercise in frustration. And I try to find out very early in the project by talking with the client to see if they really do want to know the truth, if they're open to the answer, whatever that may be, or if they've really already decided and they just want to hear the answer coming out of my mouth. An example of this kind of potential client is from time to time, someone will come, usually with satellite photos, something they've found on Google Maps, and they're very excited about it. And to me, it looks like a pile of rocks, but they're sure that underneath the surface is some kind of wonderful thing, a secret alien base or a military facility or something super valuable. Um, and assuming that it's already made it through the due diligence filter, if it's a military base, I'm not going to give that information to a random member of the public anyway. But let's say that it gets through that filter and they've asked you to tell them what's below the surface, or say inside a building that they've found. Sure, we could do that. But I ask them if the viewers do their work and we come back and we deliver the report to you and the report says there's nothing there. It's just a pile of rocks or it's just an empty building. How are you going to feel about that? And oftentimes they get very agitated and they're, no, that's not possible. I'm sure. I just know that there's something special there. I just need you to give me the details. That's a red flag. That's a project that's probably not going to go well. If they're not open to hearing the truth, it's not a project we want to do, and that's not fair to the viewers. The viewers are asked to go do their viewing, and that's very much focused on gaining the truth about the target. And if the client's not open to that, there's really no point in doing that project. There's one case that we worked on for a while that I want to tell you about, and it's kind of a sad case. It's the story of a missing hiker This missing hiker project was a little unusual in that we were working with both the police and the missing person's family. As I mentioned earlier, we mainly work just with the police on missing person cases, but in this particular case, the family was taking the lead on some of the search efforts, and the police had actually asked us to include the family in delivery of our reports, so we were doing that. So we started work on this project, and the work from the viewers indicated that the missing person was on the move, and we were trying to get a description of a location he had most recently been at. And one of the viewers gave a really detailed description of a particular building. And I can't show it to you because this is still technically an open case, but I can describe to you in general terms what happened. The viewer described a one-story wooden building of a particular color, gave some very detailed descriptions of some decorative elements, described a landmark across the street, and the detail that I found most interesting and intriguing is the viewer said that the owner of this building had a bottle collection that he was very proud of and that he displayed on shelves. And the bottles were not all identical to each other, but they were similar in kind. Um, so I wanted to see if I could find a match for this description. And I went into Google Maps, and fortunately, we had information about the trailhead where the missing person had most recently been seen. So I went and looked at the town nearest that trailhead, which fortunately was a small town, and just kind of started brute forcing my way down the main street to see if I could find a building that matched this description. And it didn't take long. I came across a building that was a one-story wooden building of this color with the landmark across the street. And then the bottle collection part made sense because it was a bar. So I was pretty excited about that. I contacted our law enforcement contact to let him know what we had found. And his reply was, "Oh, we already know about that place." And it turned out that law enforcement had already interviewed someone there, an eyewitness who had shared a meal with the missing person there just recently. So, on the one hand, that work didn't push the case forward. On the other hand, that information about this bar had not been made public. The family and law enforcement had not shared that with us. And so the fact that we were able to come to them with this information that we had developed independently really gave us instant credibility. And it was a very nice working relationship with law enforcement on the case after that. So that was great. So the viewers kept working, and we were getting more information about what was going on with this missing hiker. And what the viewers were describing, and this is multiple viewers were working independently but reporting very much the same thing. The viewers were reporting that the missing person was on the move, getting in and out of cars. It didn't sound like he was on the trail anymore, and that he was experiencing a lot of mental confusion. He was actually in pretty bad shape, both mentally and physically. And the mental confusion was consistent with something like mental illness or substance abuse or both, but it seemed pretty bad. And he was also getting into what seemed to be violent confrontations with other people. So whatever was going on with him, it did not at all sound like he was, say, injured on the side of the trail or something like that. So that's what we reported in our next report to law enforcement and the family. And the next message that I got was from the hiker's mom. And she asked if we would stop sending our work to law enforcement, if in the future we would run all of our reports through her first. And it seemed to me that what had happened is she did not want to hear these things about her son. She was not open to hearing that. She had decided that he was injured on the side of the trail. That was the only explanation that made sense to her. She did not want to consider that her son, that his own behavior or his own choices may have led to the stress the family was experiencing over his disappearance. Um, and I explained to her that that's not how we work. That's not fair to the viewers. If she was not open to whatever answer we came back with, we would just stop working on the case. But no, we were not going to have all of our work filtered through someone who didn't really want to consider all the possibilities. I think this also highlights one of the reasons that I don't like to work with families on missing person cases. when we get information from the viewers, it's important that it gets conveyed exactly as the viewers have reported it. Otherwise, you can lose important data. And when you're working with the family, there's a temptation to kind of sugarcoat things or make it easy on them, and that doesn't really help you get to the truth. So that was an unfortunate case. It was a sad case. The mom just didn't want to consider any possibility other than the one she had already decided was the answer. And the only thing she wanted to hear from us was where on the trail was her injured son. So we didn't work on that case much longer. Now I'd like to talk about the fourth and final filter that I use to decide whether to take on a project. So this is after I've already decided that it's a project I'm interested in doing. It passes the due diligence smell test, and I'm persuaded that the client genuinely wants the truth. Then I ask, does this client have the ability and the will to act? Um, you'll notice the graphic for this point is this little guy lounging on a chair, just taking it easy. And sometimes that's kind of the sense I get of a prospective client. They come and they really just want a magic show. They want to see an example of remote viewing. They're curious about it. But they really don't have either the intention or the ability to use the information that we develop and go out and see something through to the end and come back with feedback. And I guess at some level, that's the client's prerogative, especially if they're paying for the work. But I find those very unsatisfying projects to work on. And so I do look for situations where the client really is prepared to go all the way. If we're able to bring them actionable information, they're actually going to use it. Sometimes clients don't realize the amount of time and effort that goes into a remote viewing project. One project can involve dozens or even hundreds of man hours of work, depending on the size of the team and the number of retaskings that the viewers are asked to do, and the amount of analysis and report writing and so forth. So it's a big undertaking, and I want to make sure that if we do a project, that it's worth it and that someone's going to use it. Um, so in terms of ability and will to act, the ability can vary depending on the context of the project, but basically it's things like financial resources or legal power. They may need to be able to get a warrant, or they need control of the premises that needs to be searched, something like that. And in terms of the will, again, that will vary also, but by talking to the client, you can usually get a sense how determined they are to see this through to the end, or whether they're just kind of psychic looky-loos, wanting to see a magic show. And I think the best way to really drive home this point is to give you a couple of examples from projects that we've done. And this was definitely a lesson learned the hard way over time. So hopefully you'll benefit from hearing these stories. This first story is about a project we did for a client who had misplaced some jewelry. She and her husband did a lot of international travel, and when they would go out of the country, she didn't like to wear her expensive jewelry. She didn't want to lose it during the trip. So she would hide it somewhere in their home. And she would put it in kind of out of the way places, so if the home was broken into while they were away, the burglars wouldn't find it. And on one of these trips, her husband had a very serious medical emergency and had to be transported back to the US. And there was a series of medical procedures and doctor's appointments. And by the time she got around to looking for her jewelry, she forgot where she had hidden it. And so she asked if we could help with that. So I did what I normally do. I wrote up a target definition to run past her to make sure we were looking for exactly the information she wanted. And I just assumed she would want to know the current location of the jewelry. And so I wrote up the target definition that way and ran it past her. And it was a little more technical than that. I usually pin things down with an exact date and time in case they're being moved around. And if it's something that might not still be intact, I might pick one part of it to be the target. So for instance, on something like this, it might be the largest diamond or something. Anyway, I ran this target definition past her, and she said, no, that's not what she wanted. If the rings were no longer in her house, that meant they'd been stolen, and presumably they were insured. She wasn't really interested in pursuing it past where she had left them in the house. So I rewrote the target definition to be the location where she had last placed the rings. And I was excited about that because here was a project where I knew the client had the ability to follow up on the information that we would give her. We knew by definition that we were looking for something inside her own home. And so she had complete control of the premises. If our viewers did a good job and were able to describe things in enough detail, she ought to be able to recognize what they were describing and go to that spot and see if the rings were still there. So this was kind of a neat opportunity where at the very outset we knew the client had the ability to follow through. Now, the specific jewelry that the client was interested in finding, or at least remembering where she had placed, was her wedding and engagement ring set. And the viewers, of course, were not told this. The viewers work blind. And oftentimes when we're looking for a location, I will just front load the viewers and ask them to describe the target location. In this case, we didn't really need a full description of the whole neighborhood and the house. We already knew all of those things. And I really wanted the viewers to focus in very precisely on the immediately surrounding area of where the rings were or where she had placed them. So I started this project by tasking the viewers to describe the object of interest to the client. And you'll see here on the slide the responses that came back from the viewers. This is from 5 or 6 different viewers who worked on this project. And you'll see they all had really good contact with the missing object. Most of them picked up on the fact that it was a ring or set of rings. One of them there in the middle focused more on the gemstones, but still was picking up on jewelry. One of the client viewers picked up that it's metallic. The one here on the bottom right gave a number of descriptors. It's black, small, round, ringed, hard. I think most of those are right. I'm not sure about black. And the sketch is neat because it looks like a ring and then what looks to be maybe the prongs that would hold the stone in place. Over here on the bottom left, one of the viewers wrote Bridal Veil Falls. That's one of those stray cats I was talking about earlier. The viewer wasn't saying that the target was Bridal Veil Falls. The viewer was saying that there was something about the target that reminded them of Bridal Veil Falls. And of course, being a wedding and engagement ring set, you can see the connection. So it seemed that the viewers pretty quickly got contact with the correct object. So then the viewers were retasked to describe the immediately surrounding area. And what the viewers reported indicated something like a basement bathroom. How did we get that? Well, if you look at the first picture here in the upper left, that shows what looks to be a walk-in basement, a structure built into the side of a hill. The client's house was actually a very large multi-story house. I don't remember exactly how large now, but 5,000 square feet or more, I think. And that was a couple of stories on top of a walk-in basement that was on a hill, just like you see here. In this sketch, the viewer didn't even make note of the rest of the house. He just is focusing on the basement part. So that was interesting and potentially a clue. Down at the bottom from another viewer, you'll see something reminded this viewer of Nude Descending a Staircase, that famous painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, but in sunset colors. Each of those things actually turned out to be a clue. The descending a staircase part indicated that you would want to go downstairs. Nude, there's only a few places in a house that are normally associated with nudity. And the sunset colors you'll see when you see the feedback photo where that came from. Some of the other perceptions that other viewers had, there were mentions of a humid smell, lots of references to water that's stagnant, a foul smell, floating debris in the water. Don't have to go into too much detail there, I think. This is a place visited by people queue-like. Well, how many places in your house do you line up to use? And this is not a public place. And again, it's a place that has shallow, fresh water, running water, moving in a line that may indicate plumbing. So all of these things together seem to be pointing to a downstairs area where it's associated with nudity. People line up to use it one at a time. It's a private place, not a public place. there's a foul smell, there's plumbing or water. Um, all of that combined kind of points to a downstairs bathroom. So all of this went into a report that was delivered to the client. On this slide, this is a page out of the report, just so you can see what that looks like. And for this particular viewer, viewer number 6, you'll see the sketch of the object of interest, the stacked rings, and then below that, a description of where the viewer perceived that object to be, and a sketch of what looks to be a faucet over a drain. And this is a picture that the client sent me of her basement bathroom. And I think you can see the sunset colors there in that sort of orange mottled looking countertop. And when I gave this information to the client, she was delighted. She said that this is one of her favorite hiding places for jewelry. And she kind of sort of thought that was right. And so she went to look, and the rings were not there. When she uses that as a hiding place, she would put them in that cabinet under the sink. And when she went to look, they were not there. But she said that since she and her husband had returned from that trip, they'd had a lot of people in the house, family. I think she mentioned that there had been kids playing down there at one point. They'd also had some workmen in the house, and she recalled that one day she had found one of the workmen back in this part of the basement, which at the time had puzzled her because his work didn't involve that part of the house. And so she felt that we were likely on target, that this was likely a successful project, but that the rings were gone. On the other side of this wall, where the plumbing goes down into, there is a utility room and a storage room. And in that room is this trunk. And of course, remote viewing is not constrained by physical barriers like walls. So if a viewer's down in that area of the house, they're just as likely to describe something on the other side of the wall as they're under the sink. And one of the viewers did that. This is also a page from our report. And of course, at this point, I had no pictures of the inside of this client's house. I didn't know anything about how it was arranged or what might be in different rooms. And this viewer actually describes something that reminds him of a trunk or a case, something that's rectangular and woody or leathery dark material. It's worn and weathered and old. It has some metallic elements like locks or hinges or other fastenings. And he gives a couple of sketches. And there it is, right next to that trunk that's just on the other side of the wall from that basement bathroom. Also in that storage or utility room were these blue water tanks for part of their water treatment system. And one of the other viewers on the project had described that. You see here, he had drawn a couple of pictures of barrels, said something reminded him of a blue barrel of liquid, and that this was something for storage and containment and treatment. And there they are together. So that just kind of put an exclamation point on the idea that the viewers really were down in that specific part of the basement where the bathroom was and where the plumbing went back into the wall. Now, one thing that was interesting here is the viewers really focused a lot on the plumbing and the drain and the sink trap underneath that. And of course, the client didn't hide her jewelry down the drain. She would remember if she'd done that, and that wouldn't make sense anyway. But the viewers were very focused on this area down the drain. And that made me wonder if somehow the rings had ended up there. For instance, if the kids playing in the house had discovered the rings and dropped them down the sink, or if a workman was stealing them and then was startled and dropped them down the sink, or something like that. And because the client had complete control of the premises, the client had the ability to use the information that we gave her, I was very excited to find out what was going to happen. And this is another picture the client sent me of the plumbing underneath the sink in that cabinet. And you see the little sink trap here. And I was so curious to see what she was going to find when she opened that up. And this is where the project died. She completely lost interest. She felt that we had given her the information she'd asked for. We helped her remember where she put the rings. And she had no interest in pursuing this further. Again, I'm assuming they were insured. I sent her YouTube videos of how to open that up yourself. Gently suggested she might want to ask her husband to help or hire a plumber or something like that. Couldn't get her to do it. She had the ability, but at this point, her will had kind of fizzled out. I don't know why that is. I have found on some projects that clients are really into it and very excited and very interactive up to the point where they need to reveal to someone in their ordinary life that they're working with remote viewers. And at that point, they begin to doubt themselves or get embarrassed or for some reason don't want to take that next step. So it's possible, I don't know, but it's possible at this point she just didn't want to let her husband know that she was working with remote viewers or something like that. And again, it's up to her. She's the client. She seemed happy, but I really wanted to know what was down in that sink trap. And I think this is a perfect example of how you can put in a lot of work, do what seems to be good viewing, and actionable, giving the client actionable information, and they just don't have the will to see it all the way to the end. This next story illustrates the opposite problem, where the client had the will to follow through, but in the end, it turned out didn't have the ability. And sometimes you can't tell at the beginning of a project whether the client will have the ability, especially on searches. Until you figure out what location you need to search, you may not know whether the client will have access to it. But I think this story in particular illustrates the challenges you can run into when the client doesn't have the ability to follow through on the information you provide. This is a case we did for a professional artist who had a painting stolen and wanted to get that back. It was a painting from the early part of his career, and he had a real emotional attachment to it. And it was included in a collection of paintings that had been sent off to a gallery for an exhibit. And once the paintings were all hung, this one particular painting from the early part of his career was no longer there. And so we were retained to find out what happened to that. The picture you see here on the screen is from the early stages of this project, and this is from one of the viewers. And you'll note on this sketch the warm colors, the arches in the building, and this framed sort of thing over on the left-hand side. I should point out that like on all of our projects, the viewers were working blind. They did not know that this was a case for a stolen painting. They didn't know it had anything to do with the art world. All they knew is that there was an object of interest and we needed to find the location of that object. And it was a little more involved than that. They were describing a timeline of what had happened to that object. So anyway, one of the viewers gave us this sketch, and this sketch is also from the same viewer of the same location. And again, you'll note the framed item that he says reminds him of art or an elevator. And there are stairs in this picture, so that tells me we're probably looking at a multi-story building. I gave all this to the client. I really didn't have any idea what it didn't mean anything in particular to me. But I gave it to the client and he recognized it instantly. And he said, that is the gallery that I thought I was sending this painting to. And here's a feedback photo that he sent of that gallery. So you can see the viewer did a nice job of sketching that. So that told us that the painting probably did make it as far as the gallery where it was intended to be displayed. But the viewer's work also indicated that it was pulled aside, kind of tucked away and hidden somewhere, and that someone later came back and retrieved it, and that it was transported. And based on the work from some of the viewers, it sounded like it was probably transported by plane, which meant it could be anywhere. So we continued working on this. And using some tools that I don't have time to go into here, we narrowed the search area to the area you see here on the slide, this area in Chicago. It's not exactly map dowsing, but it was a similar tool that we've developed. And it seemed to converge on this area. That gallery I showed you just a minute ago was in Texas, so this was pretty far away from the starting point. And here you can also see some of the viewers had stray cats or AOLs, indicating Chicago as well. You don't always get that. Viewers don't always name the location, but in this case, several of them did. You can see here, the one on the left said something, his conscious mind was telling him something about the bean in Chicago, and that's a picture there on the slide of that sculpture that's commonly known as the bean. Another viewer said something was reminding them of the Windy City, Chicago, and another person said something was reminding them of Chicago and the lake. So this project got really interesting at this point because about half the team was describing a building like the one you see on the slide here. They were describing this grand public building made of stone, maybe some pillars, this pointed thing in the middle, really something quite distinctive. You'll see here a description from one of the viewers said that it had an artistic concept to it, the ambiance of functional art, and it reminded him of New York's Grand Central Station. And that's what the photograph is here. That's not a photograph of the target location. That's a photograph of Grand Central Station, just so you can see what the viewer was saying this reminded him of. And then there's these two sketches here from viewers showing what they were perceiving the location to be. So that gives an image of a particular type of structure that we might be looking for. The problem was that the other half of the team was telling me something completely different. They were describing a very modern building, lots of metal and glass and angles and pillars and a kind of covering awning that was coming out. And these two different things seemed very unlike each other. And I couldn't see how everyone could be right. And yet the patterns were falling into these two very distinct categories. So I was searching, I was looking at Google Maps, kind of trying to brute force my way through that area within that triangle in Chicago to see if I could find something that matched, one or the other of these things. And I found something here where the arrow is pointing at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it turns out that the Art Institute of Chicago, which is a large art museum and also has an attached art school, has two entrances. Over on the west side is the entrance to the main building, and up at the north is the entrance to the modern wing. And here on this slide, that top photo is a photo of the west entrance, that main entrance to the Art Institute of Chicago. And you can see it really does resemble the architecture of Grand Central Station and these sketches that the viewers have provided. And here's the entrance to the modern wing, which lines up with what the other half of the team was showing me. So that was pretty neat to find that, and felt like we might be on the right track there. And then some of the other things the viewers had been describing started to fall into place. You can see here a sketch from a viewer showing a very symmetric, what may be a path or an entrance with these semicircular blue things. And it turns out at the entrance to the museum are these two bronze lions. And they have that semicircular shape, and then the weathered patina is kind of that greenish blue. This is a neat thing that happened. This is from another viewer, and this viewer basically AOL'd a bedroom, and obviously that doesn't match the museum. But if you forget about the bedroom conclusion and just look at the basic shapes and the basic orientations, you'll see that this resembles the entrance quite a bit. You'll see those bedside tables actually line up with those pedestals for the planters, and the lampshades have a similar shape to the planters, although inverted. You'll notice that what's the headboard, the arch, lines up with the arch on the first level of the entrance, and then kind of inexplicably in the bedroom there's a second arch up above the headboard with a horizontal line separating it from the headboard, and that would line up with the second row of arches here in the photograph. And I think the most interesting thing there is the viewer has drawn this spike coming out of the headboard, which doesn't really make any sense in the context of the bedroom, but lines up really nicely with the flagpoles there at the location. So I think that's a good example of a viewer getting some good basic perceptions, but then the conscious mind taking over and turning it into something else. But it gets even neater because sometimes, even when the viewer's wrong about the conscious conclusion, there's some kernel of truth there. There's something that was driving that interpretation. And I did some research and I found out that the exhibit that was being shown at the museum on the day the viewer was working on this session was Van Gogh's bedrooms. So it's possible that the viewer was picking up that bedroom theme from this poster or this banner here at the entrance. And this shows that Van Gogh's bedroom exhibit was happening in February through May of 2016. And over on the right-hand side is a piece of the viewer's session showing that he did this session on April 5th, 2016. So those dates do line up. This is from another viewer who was drawing what looked like a revolving glass door. And here's another view of that with a revolving door entrance, and then on the right-hand side inside is something like a staircase. I think the viewer described that as a floating escalator in her session, or a floating staircase, something like that. And here are photos of the main entrance of the art museum, and you'll see the revolving doors and what looks like a floating staircase. Here's another sketch from that viewer, again showing the revolving door and the floating staircase, and this time with some kind of an interesting ceiling element. And here's another angle of that entrance hall to the modern wing with the revolving doors and the floating staircase and the interesting ceiling element. So at this point, I'm starting to feel pretty good that the viewers are describing the Art Institute of Chicago. There's just a lot of things falling into place. And remember, the viewers are all working blind and they're working independently of each other. This one you'll see a viewer had a stray cat of stock exchange. And I discovered that outside the modern wing of the art museum is what was the entrance to the old Chicago Stock Exchange. When that building was torn down, they saved the arch and installed it here, kind of like a sculpture out on the lawn. And then inside the museum, you'll see where that red arrow points, they've actually rebuilt the stock exchange trading room. The whole room is there. So that lined up nicely with this viewer's perception of something reminding her of a stock exchange. These three sketches are from three different viewers, again, all working blind and independent of each other. And they all seem to be showing more or less the same elements, some kind of curving or spiraling element, something resembling stairs, and some kind of chunky, blocky element. And here they are next to a photograph of a staircase inside the Art Institute at Chicago. And that staircase is over near the main entrance part of the building. Now, as the viewers were retasked and they were honing in on the location that we were needing information about, we were getting information about storage areas. You'll see here in the upper left corner, storage slots for framed objects. In the middle there, something that looks like a cabinet or a locker. And then over on the right-hand side, a locker with a person for scale, and then something above that, one or two layers of something interesting above it. And this is a photograph from the Art Institute of Chicago's school, which shares facilities with the museum part of the Art Institute. And it's one of the back rooms. It's not open to the public. It's looks like a storage area. And that lines up really nicely with some of the things the viewers were reporting. So what happened next? We put this information in a report and delivered that to the client. And he was very pleased to receive that. And he called the Art Institute of Chicago. Now, this client is sophisticated in the way that the art world works, and he made his way to the correct person at the museum to speak with about this and explained to them that his painting had been stolen and that he had reason to believe it might have made its way to their facility, and asked if they would be willing to look for it. And the person he spoke with was not really interested in having that conversation. It sounded like they might have taken some offense at the very suggestion that stolen goods were at the museum. And basically, they said, "Of course, we don't have that. We don't deal in stolen goods." And that was the end of the conversation. Um, I do want to be clear that we are not accusing the Art Institute of Chicago of in any way facilitating the sale of stolen goods. So this is an example of a client who really wanted to solve this problem, but after making that phone call, there really wasn't much more he could do. Even if he hopped on a plane and flew to Chicago, the places that needed to be searched are not open to the public, and he can't just go barging in there. So unless he could gain the cooperation of people at the museum or get law enforcement to exercise their warrant powers to go in and search, there's not much more he can do. He did file a police report in Texas, but I don't think they're going to try to get a warrant to search the Art Institute of Chicago, on the word of some remote viewers. And he also registered this with the FBI's stolen art database. So I am still hopeful that someday we'll get some feedback on this. But this is an example of the way that you can put dozens of hours of work into a project and still come up empty-handed if the client in the end doesn't have the ability to use the information that you've given them. And sometimes that's just the way it goes. I don't regret doing this project. It was actually a really neat client, and it was fun to work on, and it was neat to see all of the results coming back from the viewers. But obviously it would have been a lot more satisfying if the painting had been recovered. We've now reached the end of part one of this presentation. And to recap, there's more to a successful operational project than just good viewing. Good viewing is essential, but it's also important to pick the right clients and to manage the client relationship. This part one has talked about how to pick good clients that lead to good projects and the filters that I use to make that determination. Those four filters are: first, is it something I'm interested in? Different people can answer that question different ways. For me, I like to work on real world problems that are likely to have feedback, especially if we're able to do a good job for the client and give them information that they can use to solve their problem. Second, does the project pass the due diligence smell test? Third, do I believe that the client genuinely wants to know the truth? And fourth, is the client likely to have the will and the ability to use the information we give them to take the project all the way to a conclusion? In part two, I'll be talking about managing the client relationship and walking through the life cycle of a project and talking about things that can go right or wrong during that relationship on the project. And I'll be illustrating that with more examples of projects from the Husick Group.